Maybe, Leslie, you can start us off with this. What is this new era of conservation in the West? What does that mean?
Oh, well, thank you. I'm excited to be able to talk about that. Actually, I'm excited to see it happening across the West. Before I jump into that, very briefly, I wanted to introduce Western Landowners Alliance and particularly call out our board member who's in the audience with us tonight, Tom Page, who's over there, and also Lane Justice over here, who's our Idaho resource coordinator. So we're thrilled to be able to have a presence here in Idaho. And what the Western Landowners Alliance is we're a West-wide landowner-led, landowner-founded organization. And we're really a broad network of landowners, land managers, and partners trying to keep the working lands of the West whole and healthy for the benefit of people and wildlife. So what we're here to talk about tonight is working lands and what we're calling this new era of conservation. And just for a point of clarification, when we talk about working lands, we really mean the lands that are actively managed by people in one form or another. It can be a conservation ranch, a guest ranch, forestry, livestock. It's something we manage versus, say, wilderness, where we really take more of a hands-off management approach in wilderness. So working lands in the context of the West, of course, include a lot of private lands as well as affiliated public land leases, for example, grazing allotments. So when I say working lands, that's what we're really talking about. And when we think about conservation historically, especially in the West, most people tend to think about public lands, right? And public lands occupy a large portion of the Western landscape and are very important in lots of different ways and a real national treasure to us all. What we have to remember, though, is that the other half of the landscape in the West, in some states it's more than half, some states a little bit less. I think here in Idaho you're between 30 and 40%, are in private land ownership and under private stewardship. And what's significant about private lands isn't just the extent, but the quality of these lands. And in many cases, these lands end up being the most important lands, both for people and wildlife. And there's a reason for that. It's because when people, all the way back to the earliest indigenous times, settled in places all over the world, and certainly here, we always settle the best places first, right? We go to the places that are the most habitable for us. The places we can live year-round, where we can find good game, we can grow food, we've got water, all those things that make it possible for us to live. So we settled those places first. And those places are also the most important to wildlife for the very same reasons, right? Many wildlife come down to the lower elevations where they spend their winters. And so in this respect, the private and working lands are really the cornerstones both of our human communities and of our ecosystems. And I think many of us today feel perhaps that there's a disengagement, there's a disconnect between working lands and the rest of the world. We've got an increasingly urbanized public with less than 2% of people still out on the land managing ranches and farms and what have you. But there's actually a direct through line between every single person in the world and the working lands of the world. And I just want to do a little thought exercise with you to underscore that point. And I would start with just look at the chair that you're sitting in tonight and think about where the materials for that chair came from. And look at the building that we're sitting in and think about where those materials came from and the clothes that you're wearing. And maybe you've got a purse or a wallet with you. Maybe you've got a smartphone. Every single thing that we have on our persons around us at all times comes straight from some working lands somewhere and from the people on those working lands. That's how important working lands are to all of us, and it's the direct connection that we actually have every day, whether we realize it or not, with working lands. And the same thing goes with wildlife. They're just as dependent on these very same lands. And if you care about climate and natural solutions to climate, this is also on the working lands where we have the greatest potential to sequester more carbon, right? So it's important on all of these different levels, and yet these are the lands that we're losing, right? And we're losing them a lot. From I think 2001 to 2016 here in Idaho, you lost nearly 70,000 acres of agricultural land and development. Around the West, the Disappearing West study shows that we're losing a football field of development every 30 seconds in the West. That should scare all of us, right? And that's why this coming era, this emerging era of conservation is going to focus on private and working lands because that's where the future is for all of us and for the wildlife that we care about. And that's going to be a fundamentally different approach to conservation than what we're used to, because when we did conservation of wilderness areas, some people call it the Yellowstone model, right? It's a preservation model. We're going to draw a circle on a map around a wilderness area or a national park. We're going to legislate that. We're going to regulate it, right? And we're going to protect it. We can do it from afar. We can do it from Washington, D.C. And that's that wilderness model of preservation. But when it comes to the working lands, it's fundamentally different, and here's why. Because with wilderness preservation, we're effectively protecting and segregating nature from people and our impacts. But on working lands, we're doing almost the opposite. We're actually trying to integrate people and natural systems. We're trying to strengthen our relationship and engagement with the land, and that requires a whole nother set of strategies, tools, and really importantly, relationships. And when it comes to conservation in the context of private and working lands, people really matter. Our relationships with each other really matter. Economics matters. People's livelihoods matter. And we have to have flexibility and adaptive management because as land managers, we're juggling all these different variables and interests, right? From conservation to production to livelihoods, you name it. And we're trying to juggle all of those variables in a very fluid, dynamic living system. And every single place is different. And so we need the ability to make that adaptive management. And that means we need relationships with each other that can allow that kind of flexibility and trust and partnership. So it really comes down to, in this next era of conservation, not making it about a war between different special interests, but about figuring out ways that we can actually help one another be successful because of those through lines that we all have directly back to these working lands. The fact is, we depend on our sustenance for our survival on these working lands. So we've got to be able to figure out how we do this better together. And I want to give you an example of how this can work and how this new approach of conservation is actually opening doors to new kinds of solutions. So many of you have heard about wildlife migrations. That's been a big thing in the last decade or so as scientists discover these long migrations in places like Wyoming, where you have the red desert to hoback mule deer migration, or path of the pronghorn, or you have these elk migrations in and out of Yellowstone National Park, right? They spend their summer in Yellowstone National Park. They spend their winter down in the lower working landscapes. And people are very concerned about conserving these wildlife corridors. And here's how traditionally wildlife corridor conservation works. Scientists will discover a corridor, and then immediately people set about trying to figure out, how do we protect the corridor? What are the threats to the corridor? How do we, prevent those threats to the corridor? And those threats will usually be things like fencing, highways, housing developments, oil and gas development, grazing in some cases, all those things that could threaten the corridor. And they get together and they come up with a proposal to protect the corridor, and that usually includes land use restrictions, right? We're gonna stop this kind of development. We're gonna stop that kind of land use in order to protect the corridor. And of course, you then get the reaction from the working lands community, from the energy industry, saying, hey, no, you're gonna shut us down, right? And then we end up in this polarized fight that we always end up in. Well, in Wyoming, we were working on this, trying to figure out how we could do something differently. And we got some ranchers together, started thinking about, how could it be positive for somebody to be on that map? Ranchers hate maps, right? We hate maps because when your ranch is on a map, it usually means something bad is coming for you, right? It doesn't usually mean something good. And so how could we change that? And that's when we thought, you know what, let's flip this whole thing around. What if we started by asking not what the threats are to the corridor, but what's going right there? Why are these wildlife able to use this landscape to start with? Why are they able to keep doing this? Well, it's usually because you've got some large piece of intact land, right? And when it's private land, these are usually ranches. And you've got some kind of economic activity that's enabling that land to stay intact. And in the West, very often, that's livestock production, right? That's what's paying to keep these lands open. So what if we start by asking, how do we support what's working? How do we partner with these landowners to make sure we can keep a good thing going for wildlife? And all of a sudden, you have a whole other set of options that opens up. Now, your landowner is your best partner instead of your enemy. Now you're asking how you can support them. You can bring financial and technical support to the table. Recognition is always appreciated. We can start to have a dialogue about wildlife management to make sure that our wildlife management supports that ranch and the wildlife that are using that ranch, right? And this becomes a very collaborative relationship. So in the state of Wyoming, this was exactly the approach they adopted when they got together with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and created the USDA Wyoming Big Game Migration Partnership. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture brought a whole bunch of those technical and financial resources to the table. A bunch of nonprofit organizations from the Greater Yellowstone Coalition to WLA to TNC to a whole bunch of others got together. We threw in capacity, philanthropists threw in money, and we got record signups going on in Wyoming. We've got more demand than the USDA can meet. The USDA, based on the success of the program, recently expanded it to to Montana and to Idaho. And we had a fabulous signing in Washington where we were standing side by side. We had the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. We had the Wyoming Stock Growers. We had the Wyoming Department of Game and Fish. We had Secretary Vilsack, and we had Governor Gordon all standing there celebrating this together. That's the path that we can take in this new era of conservation by helping one another be successful. And I'll just say this, if that's the future that we want to create, that's a future that integrates rather than segregates people and nature. It aligns economics with ecology. It creates positive relationships among people, and it keeps both people and land whole. And I'll close by just saying this. Aldo Leopold said that the oldest task in human history was to learn how to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And today, on an increasingly crowded planet, is not only the oldest task, but it's now our most urgent. Thank you.
Lesli, thank you so much for outlining that vision.